Dear colleagues, dear students, I think it's time to start. Actually, we're past academic code. You know, in Europe, there is such a thing as academic code. 15 minutes, the teacher, the lecturer is waiting for the students. So now we are past this academic code, we can start. So it gives me much pleasure to introduce and to welcome today Professor Jeffrey Preйтер from Iowa State University. He staged, yes, that's it. He graced the stage at our university last year for the first time, but it's not his first lecture, it's not his second lecture in Russia. Actually, it's 71st lecture in Russia, and he started in 2005 as a Fulbright professor at Kaliningrad State University. And now his popularity is snowballing. He is lecturing now 3 lectures a day in Moscow. It's, well, it was Moscow State Lomonosov University, it was Moscow State Linguistic University, it was Conservatoire, it was the Museum of Tchaikovsky Klin, where Professor Preйтер delivered a lecture on American perception of Tchaikovsky. So it was a unique new lecture. And please come in. And today he gave a lecture to the Sharapin's Museum, and as Marina Rafaelовna told us, there was some announcement on Radio Moscow about his lectures. So it's a real pleasure, a privilege to have Professor Preйтер here, but I'd like to say he's not a professional lecturer on history of American music. He's a composer, and for many years he was the director of the division of composition. He's a real composer, and he's created 90 musical pieces, and he has awarded several awards. But the most important piece is his oratorio, Veni Creator Spiritus, which he wrote, he composed for the Expo 2000 to Hanover, and he was commissioned to do it. So he's quite a renowned composer. But he started his second career as a lecturer in the history of American music in 2005. So I won't keep you anymore. Just want to say that he holds his PhD degree in music composition from Iowa State University. And of course, for many years he's been professor of music, chair of the music theory division, and past director of Iowa State University Chamber Singers. Actually, Professor Preйтер can sing during the lecture, so if you ask him, because he has a perfect voice and has been teaching his students for many years, this is unique with him. So I don't want to steal any more time. Professor Preйтер, you are most welcome to our university.
Allow me. I'm going to be comfortable when I do this. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my joy to be here. I just really enjoy this. As a matter of fact, I decided to stay one extra day in Moscow. I've been here with the United States Embassy, and they've been having me talk around town. But my favorite thing to do is to speak at universities to students of English like yourself, because I don't need to have interpretation, and I can kind of get carried away, and we'll just have a great time talking a little bit about the origins of blues and jazz today. I think that's what was the topic that was given to you. Is that right? We're here to do blues and jazz. I think, first of all, the slide that I played at the very beginning, of course, you all know who that is, right? That's Louis Armstrong. And that piece of music was probably recorded sometime later after the actual origins of blues and jazz. But it gives, but since Louis Armstrong was such an important part of the beginnings of jazz in America and New Orleans around the early 1920s, 1910 and 20s, I just couldn't resist putting a slide in with Louis Armstrong singing Give me a kiss to build a dream on. Well, let's go back now. Let's go back quite a ways, actually, to the African influences on the birth of jazz, because jazz is a music that came out, or at least originally came out of the black community in the United States. This is black heritage music that has been adopted freely by all different kinds of ethnic people. There's jazz performed all over the world by all different kinds of races and people, and it's perhaps America's most original music. Let's go to the next slide. Of course, the story of black music in the United States is not always a happy one. The unhappy part is that by 1619, blacks were being imported into the New World against their will as slaves. And perhaps between 600,000 and 650,000 black people actually were imported from Africa directly into the New World, not only in the United States, but also some of the Caribbean islands and other parts of North America to be slaves. Of course, there were many, many more than 650,000 slaves at some point, because they had children and their families grew, and the slave owners, of course, when the black people would have children, the slave owners had rights to also own the children. This is not a happy part of American history for me. I don't like to talk about this too much, but it's the truth, and we might as well say what the truth is. You can see an artist's idea of what the landing of slaves in Virginia in 1619 might have been about, what it was like. And here we see slaves being led away to the slave auctions where they would be sold, being led away in leg chains, they're called shackles, and being led away to market, if you will. It's a terrible thing to think about people being sold, isn't it? Bought and sold. It's still going on today, in one way or another, and it's a real scourge on our humanity when we get involved in that kind of thing. The black slaves, when they came, however, brought with them their religious customs and ceremonies, and also their social ceremonies and customs. And we see some art about these kinds of ceremonies. Notice that it appears, anyway, as you look at these paintings, that they are doing what? They're dancing. And if they're dancing,
they're having a good time.
They're having a good time. What does it take to dance? Of course, I can stand up here and but most of you don't do that, because if you did that, everyone would think you were kind of crazy, right? What does it take to make dance? It takes music, you know. And so, quite obviously, music of one kind or another, it might have been music on instruments that make melody, or perhaps it could have been music, simply rhythmic music produced on drums or other kinds of percussion instruments. We don't know, of course, from these paintings, but the idea is that dance and music were a very big part of the ceremonies of the blacks that came to the New World as slaves. They probably brought with them some of their instruments, or if their instruments were easy to build, they could have made copies of them here in the New World.
And we see a certain kind of instrument, looks almost like a banjo, doesn't it, in the middle. This, by the way, was a drawing that was done on a plantation in Cuba. And these are the slaves who worked on plantations in Cuba. So it wasn't just in the United States itself, Cuba, the islands, some even in Central America. However, if once the black slaves became more assimilated into the culture of the New World, United States, Canada, the Caribbean, and so on, we see them begin to be playing on the Western instruments, the Western instruments played by whites. You notice the one on the far right looks like a trombone. It's interesting, the bell on this trombone is going out the back, whereas usually it's bent and comes out the front now. We see a piccolo player, a horn player, a clarinet player, and of course a drummer. This is actually, this group of instruments is actually very, very similar to what jazz in the early 1900s in New Orleans turned out to be. Small ensembles of instruments very similar to this, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. The African musical roots of Black Americans. Black music from Africa has distinct musical characteristics. Complex syncopated rhythms. All right, well, what's syncopation? Would you, I wish I could do that. Would you clap with me, please? Yeah, keep it going. Notice that the surface rhythms that I was making up, kind of badly, but I'd rather have you hear Ella Fitzgerald do that, but the rhythms that I was making up kind of badly there didn't always agree with your clapping, did they? This disagreement between the pulses of an underlying beat and the surface rhythm that runs across the grain with it, this is called syncopation, rhythmic syncopation. And for those of you who aren't musicians, lots of musicians here? Okay, you musicians are going to have to put up with me. I'm going to have to sometimes explain some things to the others. I hope that you won't be bored to death when I do this, because musicians know all of these things. Improvisation. Improvisation is kind of like what I just did right there. It's to compose in real time, to make something up that turns out to be musically viable, but where you do it in real time on an instrument or with your voice. Some of us do this, and some of us actually do this without even thinking. How many of you like to sing when you're in the shower? Yeah, okay. Well, when we sing in the shower, sometimes we sing the melody as the way it is, and sometimes we'll bend it a little bit and say, yesterday, love was such an easy game to play. Yesterday, love was such an easy game to play. You know, notice what I'm doing? I'm adding extra notes, and I'm improvising on a tune. Sometimes this is what jazz musicians do. They have a tune that, a standard tune or some kind of tune that everyone recognizes, and then they improvise away on it. Sometimes you can barely tell that it was the original tune because it is so decorated in one way or another. Improvisation, very important part of Black African music. Bending of pitches. I've been working so hard. Notice, bending the pitches. This is also something that comes right out of Africa. I have a good friend who sings with me in my church choir at home, and this lady is from Germany. And every time we get to do spirituals and so on, she has such a hard time with rhythmic aspects and the aspects of bending pitch, because this is simply not part of her culture, not part of her musical upbringing. Let's see, I got a criminal in the kingdom, made that good news. And she wants to, I have a crown up in other kingdom, made that good news. Black music not only bends the pitches sometimes, but it also bends the rhythm. And we have something called, in jazz terms, sometimes we call it swing, where we'll swing a rhythm. If you actually try to play the rhythms that are notated on jazz charts, for instance, and jazz charts are the scores of the music for jazz, if you try to actually play the rhythms like a European, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if you use this kind of swing technique that you learn as jazz musicians, then everything kind of makes sense and starts to flow the way it should. Notice I can't talk about this music even without moving a little bit. I can't stand still, and that's part of what's so wonderful about this music. Also, call and response. So if I were to do this to you, I want you to respond to me. If I were to say, hello, what would you say back? Hello. Yeah, okay, I'll say, hello, and you'll say, hello. Okay, I'm calling to you and you're responding to me. This is called a call and response form, and these kinds of forms were very, very important in Black African music. It was partly because sometimes there would be a leader, and the leader would know, and the leader perhaps would know the right words or know the right inflections, and then the group would simply imitate that back. This is call and response. It's a very important part of Black music, and it turns out to be a very important part of Black music up to the present. So we'll talk a little more about that later. Of course, African music is often associated with motion and dance. It's hard to not move with some of these complex, wonderful rhythms, even if you just have a bunch of percussion instruments, log drums and maybe triangles and other instruments that make percussion sounds. You can make a wonderful kind of dancing-like rhythm, and you don't even need a melody. To demonstrate a call and response form, I'd like to play one for you. This is an old recording. Some of these are very old recordings, and they're scratchy, but you'll get the idea. If you want to move on to it. I think you get the picture, right? It's almost like the leader is teaching the group the song as they go along.
What country was that?
I'm not sure actually where that came from, because the place where I found that recording didn't say. It simply said Africa. And it didn't say which country in Africa.
Africa is big.
I know. It's probably, I would not be surprised. It's not northern Africa. This would be probably central maybe Central Western Africa. I wouldn't, but it's probably not Northern Africa in the Moroccan lands and so on. This would be certainly south of that, in Black Africa. It's a good question. Maybe I'll have to see if I can do some more research on that and find out where that came from. It's the first time anybody's asked that question. That's a really good one. Okay. Also, there were some societies in Africa that communicated from one village to another by means of drums and percussion instruments that the sounds would carry for long distances. And this feature of using drums like a telegraph across perhaps several kilometers. These were sometimes called the talking drums. And there were even some cultures, and I'm going to have to plead ignorance again, I'm not sure which ones, but there were some cultures that actually used drums to imitate the inflections of the human voice. By changing the pitch of the drums we all know what modern timpani are like when you push the pedal down and it tightens the head and makes the pitch go higher and lower. These are instruments we use in the West all the time and in our European culture. But in Africa, they had other means of tightening and loosening the heads on drums, and they actually could make sounds that sounded something like the imitation of human voice. Some people say even that they were so good at interpreting these things, they could almost tell what people were saying when they heard this. Here's an example of that. Oh, I went the wrong way, didn't I? Okay. There we go. Two most important influences, musical influences on the production of early jazz in the United States were a couple of genres we call the blues and ragtime music. These two genres tended to produce the materials that that early jazz musicians were able to bring together and create a new art form. First of all, we're going to look at the blues. Now, we got into the call and response stuff before. I'm going to teach you a real call and response right now. This is one that actually was used in the fields, and my generation, I won't tell you how many generations ago that was, but my generation was one of the last to actually learn these kinds of things in school. This isn't done much anymore. There are some politically correct reasons for that, and I'm not going to get into that too much, but the idea is that we all knew, at least this particular call and response form, or call and response tune, that would have been used in the fields by slaves who were picking cotton. Cotton, in the United States, cotton was the most important export in the 18th and 19th centuries. We were the world's leading producer of cotton at that time. And cotton is a very, very labor-intensive kind of crop. Back then, it had to be picked by hand. I think there are machines that do this now. Of course, they pick the cotton balls off the bushes. But then once you've picked the cotton balls off the bushes, you have to separate the seeds out of the middle of this wad of cotton. And that's really hard to do, and it takes a lot of labor to do it. There was a man by the name of Eli Whitney, an American, who came along in the early 19th century and invented a device called the cotton gin. And you put the cotton balls in this thing and crank it, and it separated the seeds from the cotton. Once he had done this, the production of cotton went way up. The average plantation owner then could produce a lot more cotton. But still, the cotton had to be picked, and it had to be picked by hand. The cotton balls had to be picked by hand off of the bush, and of course the owners, the slave owners, would have the slaves picking the cotton. And the more cotton they picked, of course, the more cotton they could put through the cotton gin, the more cotton they could sell to the manufacturers who were making textiles and so on. So they needed a lot more labor, not to separate the seeds from the cotton now, but to actually pick the cotton so that they could make higher productions. And so we have blacks in the field picking cotton, and this is an old work song that black slaves would have used, and it would go something like this. I'll be the leader, and I'm going to go, "Oh Lordy," and you'd go, "Pick a bale of cotton." Can you do that for me, please? Pick a bale of cotton. And now go, "Oh Lordy, pick a bale a day." Okay? Okay. I'm going to say, "Oh Lordy, pick a bale of cotton. Oh Lordy, pick a bale a day." Let's do it. Now let's do it together. 1, 2, 3. Go. "Oh Lordy, pick a bale of cotton. Oh Lordy, pick a bale a day." And you know that work songs like this, the sailors used them. Other groups of people who had to do heavy physical labor would use work songs because when you're doing things together and you're doing things in rhythm to music, you can get a lot more done. And you can work harder and you put the effort into it at the same time. Sailors would use this to raise the sails on old ships and they would get along the big windlass and raise the anchors. They would have what they would call sea shanties or work songs that would do this as well. So we have the black slaves in the field doing sometimes very, very simple work songs like this, where there would be a leader and a follower, and of course you're picking a bale of cotton. A bale is a large square of something. Cotton, hay, other things can be put in bales. It's a large square, and then these large squares are wrapped with bands, either of wire or sometimes of string to hold them together. And picking a bale of cotton took a lot of time and a lot of work. If you could pick a bale of cotton in a day by yourself, this was a major accomplishment because cotton's not very heavy. Okay, well, if you were a slave, maybe you wouldn't feel much like singing. If you were a slave owner, maybe you wouldn't feel much like having your workers sing unless they could be more productive. So there's really two sets of answers to why slaves sang at work. And these are complicated answers, actually. The white answers, the white slave owners, well, my slaves are much more productive when they're singing and they're working in concert and they're picking bales and putting putting the cotton balls in the bags so that they can make bales of cotton. Sure, let them sing if it's going to make more cotton. Slaves learn the white culture faster. Yeah, and all you have to do is teach them a new song and they can be out there singing in English, right? They can be singing in English, they can be singing religious songs from the Christian church, and they can learn the white culture a little faster. And also, in some African cultures anyway, the idea of singing was a community, festive, spirited thing and did not arouse anger and aggression as sometimes the drum music and the instrumental music might have done. So the white slave owners were no fools, and they said, oh sure, well, let them sing if it's going to keep them happy, right? Now, the black answers, why did they sing at work? It makes this awful work perhaps a little more tolerable. I don't know what that means. How being forced to do something can be tolerable, but if you have to do something, you might as well make the best of it, right? And this is how they tried to make the best of their situation, by singing at work, making the work a little easier. The songs also quite the opposite of what the white slave owners thought. It also helped keep the African traditions and customs alive, because they not only sing pieces in English or in some Western language, but they would probably also sing pieces from in their native African dialects as well. It's also true that some of the singing that the slaves did contained secret messages, especially secret messages about perhaps how to escape the slave owners and to go to some place where slavery was abolished or was no longer practiced. In the United States, before the American Civil War, there were numerous states, most of them in the North, that abolished slavery, and it was not legal to own slaves. For instance, in New York State or in Pennsylvania and some of these states in the North. So if you were a slave working on a southern plantation somewhere, where would you want to go if you were going to escape? North. Yeah. You were going to want to go north. And I have an example here of a black work song. This is a modern arrangement of it. I don't have an old arrangement of it, but this is a modern arrangement of this old folk song, or old work song, where they're actually saying, follow the drinking gourd. Well, in the slave fields, in the cotton fields, the slave owners would put out big barrels of water, and these barrels were sometimes on carts. And then in the barrel was either a large spoon that they would drink from, or a hollowed out piece of squash. Actually, this hollowed out piece of squash would have a bowl on one end that looked kind of like a big spoon, and this is called a gourd, or a drinking gourd. And they would hollow out, they would take the seeds out, and they would be this big hollowed out spoon on one end, and dip it in the water barrel and drink. So following the drinking gourd, the white slave owners just thought, oh, okay, they're following the drinking gourd down the field as the barrel is being pulled down the field and as they're picking the cotton. But it turned out to be that, notice this is the constellation Ursa Major, for those of you who are astronomers. Sometimes it's called the Big Dipper, sometimes it's called the Big Bear in some languages too. I don't know what it's called here in Russian, but the Big Bear, okay? Well, it's called the Big Bear here, but sometimes we call it the Big Dipper because it looks kind of like a big dipper that you would put in a barrel. Right? And the two stars on the end point toward Polaris, or the North Star. And this is how you find your way north if you're navigating by the stars. Interesting that now they're following the drinking gourd. Takes on a different meaning. We're following the drinking gourd so that we can find our way, which direction? North, and perhaps to freedom. So let's, and you'll hear it in this song too, it talks about the old man is waiting to carry us to freedom if you follow the drinking gourd. The old men, there were a number of old men who were acting as guides to escaped slaves and helping them go north. And this must be about one of these old men who were helping them find their way north and following the drinking gourd to freedom. But the blacks tended to keep a lot of their African traditions, even though they were worshiping a new god in a way, or in a new way. They became Christians, and they were worshiping the Christian God and Christ. Here's an example of a black preacher in a small church. This is a very old recording, and you can actually sometimes hear this kind of thing even still today in black churches in America, where the preacher will start, and he will start talking, and then the people will respond to him in this call and response sort of way, like we've been talking about. They will respond to the sermon. He'll say something like, "Well, don't you just love God?" And they'll say, "Oh, yes, Jesus," and they'll have this conversation during the sermon. Not something that you're likely to find in my church, or probably not the Orthodox church either, right? But this idea of talking back and forth, and then it starts getting more excited, and as the pastor gets more and more excited during his sermon, they all of a sudden they start breaking into song, and it's almost improvised, and you'll hear the pastor sing, and then the congregation will sing along with them, and you have this big improvised singing kind of thing. And here's what it sounds like. It's very difficult to understand, so don't try to understand it. the congregation answering. Now they're starting to sing. And the longer it goes on, the more exciting it gets, and the more rhythmic it gets, and the more call and responses there are. But all of this excitement and so on is only one side of the religious experience of the black church. There's also the very, very troubled and prayerful kind of part where they're trying to be patient with their lives as they know it and looking forward to heaven and talking about their troubles to God. And here is an example of a very early spiritual. Improvisation. The woman was not exactly singing the same thing as the man from time to time. Syncopated rhythms, all of these things, and this sounds a lot like traditional blues, doesn't it? If you listen to a lot of old blues, this is very, very similar to that. The only difference between this piece and a blues piece, at least in terms of the basic feeling of the piece, is that this piece has a religious text, and the blues generally has a more secular text. Here's one of the earliest recorded blues singers. His name is Robert Johnson, and he lived a very short life. He only lived from 1911 to 1938, but he became a very, very popular and important blues singer in the southern parts of the United States. And these people were originally kind of like the minstrels of the Middle Ages. They would go from one town to another, they would sing the songs. Sometimes they would sing songs about events that happened somewhere so that people could hear the news from a different place. Often blues pieces had many, many verses, and they told a story, almost like a ballad. Often they used very small performing forces. Sometimes at the very beginning it was just one person, a man or a woman, and a guitar. Where they would play their own guitar and they would sing the blues. The actual term blues, of course, comes from the idea of the color blue is associated sometimes with being sad or depressed. I'm blue today, you might say in the United States, in American English at least. Things are I'm just feeling so blue and down, depressed. And this fits this music pretty well because most of the pieces that we talk about as traditional blues have texts that are sad and depressing or troubling in some way or another. Melancholy spirit, I guess that's as good a word as I could figure out. Having a melancholy subject, often they're in a slow tempo, not always. We're going to hear an example by Ella in a few minutes that's not slow, but often slow tempo, often in what we call 12-bar blues form. And this is something I want to teach you a little bit about, because this is kind of the traditional form of blues. There are other forms now too, but this is more or less the traditional form. We're going to talk about a blues piece here that we're going to listen to Robert Johnson singing, at least the first verse or so, of the 3220 blues. 3220, what's that? 3220 is the size of a bullet that goes in a pistol. He shoots his girlfriend, and then he's sorry about it, wants to bring her back. We all laugh at that, but it's kind of the way he sings it. It's pretty sad, but it's kind of strange, isn't it? You shoot somebody, and then you want to bring them back. But that's often the way it is. It's kind of like, how many of you ever like to go on and you get a little bit of, you have a few rubles in your pocket, and you decide, oh, I'll buy a new iPad. And then once you bought it, oh, I don't know if I should have done that. Buyer's remorse is what we call that. That's the kind of feeling he had here. I think he caught her being unfaithful, he shot her, and now he wants her back. Okay, people are never happy, are they? The blues form, the traditional 12-bar blues form is like this. We have a section that I'm going to call the letter A. Okay, the letter A is a section of the text, and it says, "I sent for my baby, and she don't come." Well, that's not good English, but you know what I mean. She doesn't come. Okay, and then it repeats, "I sent for my baby, and she don't come." And then we have a contrasting verse we'll call B. "All the doctors in Hot Springs sure can't help her none." And I'm going to bring her back from the dead, apparently, right? So here's Robert Johnson singing these lines. Same thing over here.
I sent for my baby, and she don't. All the doctors in Hot Springs sure can't get her. And if she gets some relief, then she don't know.
And it starts about 500,000 verses to tell the whole story, right? Of how he found her, with some other man, and he was enraged, and it goes on and on and on. Now, let's take a look musically at what a 12-bar blues form is. I wish I had a piano here. It would be a lot easier to demonstrate it than what I'm going to do here. But the idea is that this traditional blues uses at least it takes at least 3 main chords. You musicians know that you can harmonize almost any folk song if you use a chord that is built on the first degree of the scale. Sometimes we call that tonic. Yeah? And if we build a chord on the 4th scale degree, the subdominant, and the 5th scale degree, the dominant. Now, those are indicated by the Roman numerals underneath the big capital 1, the capital 4, and the 5. Now, you'll see it says 4/4 time up there. That means that there are 4 counts or 4 pulses in every measure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. 1, 2, 3, 4. And notice that the tonic chord, or the 1 chord, stays for the first 4 measures. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2. 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, and then it changes to the 4 chord. 5, 6, then back to 1, 7, 8, then it goes to 5, 4, and back to 1 again. All right. 8, 12 measure blues is all about. Now let's go back and listen to Robert Johnson again quickly.
I stand for my baby, and she don't.
3, 4,
I stand for my baby,
6,
and she
7,
don't.
8,
All
9,
the time with them was
10,
she'll can't get
11, 12. Notice that he didn't always agree, he didn't always change right when I said 1 or 6 or 11, did he? He waited a little bit, he syncopated actually when the entrances happen. This is very typical of traditional blues. It doesn't always happen at exactly the right moment, at exactly the right time, kind of like the computers that are needed to send us to the moon or something. He would vary things slightly, but I think you can see that this piece is in a, what, 12-bar blues. Now, a couple other materials that we need to talk about. Most of you know the major scale. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, ti, la, sol, la, mi, re, do. Everybody knows that, right? Do, re, mi, re, mi, fa, mi, re, mi, fa. You know, was it Julie Andrews does that in The Sound of Music, right? Okay, listen to this now. The major scale has 7 different notes, and this one has 6. There are several forms of the blues scale. It's not just one, but this is one of the more popular ones. And this is sometimes called the blues scale. And here's a simple piece of music that I composed really quick on my computer. It's horrible, but to give you an idea, this is a piece of music with the major scale. And nothing to write home about, but it's okay. Now listen here. How that's bent a little bit, right? The pitches are not quite the same. It's in the cracks, perhaps, a little bit. And this is one of the scales that blues musicians use a lot when they produce blues. All right. Now, I'm always at this point tempted to say that in this regard, the Soviet Union was way, way ahead of the Western world in that women and men could do all the same jobs, right? And were given the same kind of responsibilities for things. Now, I don't know whether that's still true in Russia or what, but I know that we're making some progress on it in the United States, and we've only made progress on it really since about World War II. We're working on trying to get women the same amount of money for the same work that a man does and that kind of thing. But in the blues, it was never a problem. Blues singers, men and women, were absolutely equal from the beginning. And as a matter of fact, sometimes it was the women blues singers that were more famous and better paid and all that than the men. So I want to show you some examples of women and the blues, some from way back. First of all, we have Ma Rainey. Ma, of course, is short for mother. Ma Rainey, from 1886 to 1939. She's got a blues piece here called the Travelin' Blues. Here's a woman, she's singing about a woman who's sitting in a train station someplace, probably in a small town. She said, "I done bought my ticket." That means I bought my ticket, but I don't know where I'm going. You ever had that feeling? Like you just want to escape someplace, and it doesn't matter where you're going, you just want to get out of there. I don't know where I'm going, but I've got a ticket, I just got to get out of here. Well, this is the same feeling that Ma Rainey was trying to give us. I'll play a little bit of Ma Rainey now. Old recording. You can hear the sadness and depression in these pieces. It just oozes out of the singers, the great blues singers. Here's another singer comes on a little later. This is Bessie Smith, also born in the 19th century, about 1937, and this piece is called the Bed Bug Blues. You all know what bed bugs are? If you do, I wish you didn't. And if you've ever been bitten by one, it's not a fun experience. I guess there's a huge worldwide infestation now of bed bugs. Do you have a problem with that here? There is some in the United States, I know. You know what they are, though. These bugs that get in your mattress and then they bite you at night, and it's really very painful. Well, that's what a bed bug is. At least that's what the dictionary definition is, right? However, the bed bug she's talking about isn't an insect. It's this man that she has been with, and apparently he's not a very faithful man at that. And he just treats her very badly. And at the end she says, he's just a woodpecker and I'm a piece of wood. The blacks were always much more free about talking about the real things of life than some of us white people who get a little embarrassed by this stuff. So I'll play a little bit of Bessie Smith and the Bed Bug Blues. Bed bug is evil. He doesn't mean me any good. That's repeated. 5, 7, 8. Ain't he the woodpecker and I'm a chunk of wood. And finally, someone you all know, Ella Fitzgerald. And now, this is not a slow blues anymore, even though the words are the same as the slow blues tradition. She makes an up-tempo version of this. This is the St. Louis Blues. said that she had this secret desire to be like Ella Fitzgerald in her next life. She really wanted to be able to sing like that. An up-tempo version of the blues, but still, what? Good old 12-bar blues. Well, the fella is the king of the blues. B.B. King is probably the king of the blues. Not only because of his name being king, but he is in fact one of the great performers of the United States. He has not only played solos and with his own big bands and so on, but in order to reach younger audiences, he was playing with U2, and he played with Clapton. He was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Mississippi because of all of the performing and all of what he has done for blues and performing musicians of the South. He's still, well, I say he's still, I wrote this slide a while ago. He's almost 90 years old now. But I saw him just 2 or 3 years ago in my town. He came with a band. And he had to sit down to play, but he still plays. And he plays very, very well. But even up to about 10 years ago or so, he was doing perhaps 300 concerts a year. 300 nights of playing. You have to really love what you're doing to do something like that. And he just absolutely loved to play the blues. Now here's a piece that's pretty well known. This is Let the Good Times Roll. And Let the Good Times Roll, he actually was teaming up for this performance with Eric Clapton. this wonderful tune called Alberta. It sounds like a pop ballad, but in fact it's a 12-bar blues. White women. This is Bonnie Raitt. She just travels all over everywhere. You can see her here playing with B.B. King. Down here on the bottom right. She sings and plays with so many musicians and has been awarded a number of important awards for both blues and country music. Here's a blues piece that has made her quite famous. The name of it is Woman Be Wise, and don't advertise your man. She goes on to say that, you know, women these days, you know, if you don't sit around having any conversations with your girlfriends because they'll come along and steal your man away from you. So, woman, be wise, keep your mouth shut. And what? Don't advertise your man. Everybody laughs. I think that this is something that you've heard about before. Okay. Actually uses some black accent in her voice to make it sound like blues.
Now will be wise. Keep your mouth shut. Don't advertise your man. Don't mess around. Holding no conversation. Explain what your good man.
Women now these days, they don't do it.
And try to steal your man from you. Now will be wise.
Keep your mouth shut.
Don't advertise your man. Don't be a fool.
Don't be a fool.
Don't advertise your man.
Oh, no, your best girlfriend.
Yeah.
Look like a highbrow.
Yeah.
You know, see, they're actually having, she's actually having a conversation with another singer at this point, and this is also kind of call and response kind of thing, isn't it? You hear this sometimes where, you know, the music's going on in the background. Now you know that. Oh yeah, I know all of them. Just like the black church service we were listening to before. And even though Bonnie Raitt is very white with red hair, the blues style the blues, the basic background behind the blues is just as much with her. Now we're going to talk about ragtime. I may have to do this a little quicker than we did the blues. But ragtime music was popular especially, at least the first, it's still popular today, but it was especially popular. It was the rock and roll of its time, actually, in the 1890s through about 1910. And it was like rock and roll in the sense that when rock and roll first happened, when I was a teenager, you know that all of our parents just loved it, right? They just loved rock and roll, they hated it. Oh, and they didn't understand why we wanted to listen to this terrible new music and why anybody would want to bother with this kind of thing. And it was the same thing with the parents back in 1890 when ragtime music came, because ragtime music to some of these parents was shameless ragtime music. You're shame on you if you go and dance to this wicked music. Okay? That's probably why it became so popular. All you have to do is have a parent say, what, you can't do that, or you shouldn't like that, and what are you going to do? Anybody who knows anything about psychology knows that. If you want to get somebody to do something, you tell them, oh, you can't do that. I've even had professors, I remember I had a professor one time, he just said, oh, well, you're just never going to be able to write this counterpoint or whatever. And, well, I went home and I made sure that he knew I was going to do it. At any rate, that was the rock and roll of its time. Ragtime actually comes from the word ragged rhythm. Ragged means ragged is if you have an old piece of, people have jeans that have holes in the knees and that kind of thing. It's still, this used to be in anyway. Jeans with holes in the knees and frayed and that kind of, this is what we call ragged material. And so ragged rhythms are actually syncopated rhythms, rhythms that don't line up with the beats like we've been talking about all along. And this kind of thing comes actually almost out of some kinds of rhythmic speech that you might have even heard on the street at one time. Here's an example of a boy who's shining, a black boy, who is shining somebody's shoes. And as he's shining the shoes, he's kind of like a rap singer of 4 or 5 generations ago. He's kind of making up this little poem as he goes along. Here's rap from the 1920s.
Now we shine your shoe like a little claws when that boy to get that shoe and roll right off. Shine.
Shining the shoes.
Now we shine that shoe like a little blade, we cry to that dog, not the leg, son. Now we get that shoe like a little claws, the water hit it, they gonna roll right off, son.
Those kinds of rhythms found their way into a traditional American form called the minstrel show. Now, minstrel shows were very popular in the 19th century, from about 1940 up around to the turn of the century, around 1900 or so. And actually, their influences were maintained even after that by the movies. And actually, there are many musical forms in the United States that have been directly affected by minstrel shows. The problem with minstrel shows was that they were often, you see these people sitting here, they look like black people, but they're not. These are white people that are dressed up like black people. They put black stuff on their faces and hands, and they were there to kind of make fun of black humor. They were making fun of black people, and everybody would laugh when they would do this kind of thing. This is no longer acceptable in the United States to do this. But the only reason that I include it here is because it is so important in the it's so important in the background of jazz as we know it and of American music in general that it can't be ignored. Here's, for instance, a typical march that one might hear in a minstrel show. Okay, if you're going to bend pitches, what's one of the best modern instruments to bend a pitch with? What are those? Da-da-da-da-da-da-da, those trombone, right? Bow, bow. You can bend pitches with trombone so easily. And of course, this is part of the black music culture from a long time. All right. The military march was another influence on this. Between the minstrel show and the military march, we have these kind of driving rhythms, but then with the syncopations and then with a kind of piano technique, sometimes called stride technique, where you're doing this kind of thing on the piano. And any piano players in here? Anybody played Scott Joplin or anything like that? Where you're constantly, it's really easy to miss too, isn't it? Ragtime music was actually invented in and around St. Louis, Missouri, and another place called Sedalia, Missouri, in, right around 1895. And this band here, Tom Turpin, published one of the very, very first ragtime pieces called the Harlem Rag. They published that in 1895. But the king of, this is Scott Joplin. This is Maple Leaf Rag. He worked in a club called the Maple Leaf Club, and he wrote this piece about the Maple Leaf Club. Now, Joplin's music has been arranged for a lot of different ensembles. He originally composed it for piano, but it's been arranged for a lot of ensembles. These are actually two pieces that you'll hear in the movie The Sting with Robert Redford and Paul Newman. Has anybody ever seen this film? Yeah, it's a great film. It's a wonderful film about how these two guys trick the gangsters and make off with a lot of their money. We'll have to look at it sometime. I think it's out in Russian someplace too. I'm not sure, but what's the name in Russian? No. Okay. At any rate, here's one of the examples. Example for violin and piano. This is called Easy Leaders. And then the theme song from the movie itself. Sometimes people call this, sometimes it's actually even been published in modern piano books for children, so on. It's called The Sting, but really the name of it is called The Entertainer, and this is the main theme from the movie The Sting. Now the arrangement. Okay, a little ragtime music. Got that in your ears. Now we're going to take a look at the beginnings of jazz. Just really briefly. It was first called jazz, J-A-S-S, and apparently in one African dialect or another, I'm not sure which one, this means African, it means speeded up. But it was changed to J-A-Z-Z because the last three letters of J-A-S-S makes a kind of a bad word, and you don't know. Influenced by ragtime, the blues, improvisation, of course, is an important element where the players would play pitches that would be not part of the original tune, but would be around the original tune. Oh, yeah, this is America's original music. They kind of bring all of these elements together in a small group, kind of like this one up here. They start playing kind of this form of blues, but it's not really blues either, for just instruments and no singers. Now here's a straight tune. Okay, this is a tune called Black and Blue. Now, somebody actually took the trouble to write down what Louis Armstrong actually played when he was playing the same tune. And you'll hear that it's about the same, starts about the same, but then he starts taking all kinds of improvisatory liberties with this piece. Basically takes and works with the tune and improvises upon it and adds things to it to make it his own piece of music. Just a little bit of Louis Armstrong at the very beginning. This is a group of his called the Hot Five, and they're playing a piece called the West End Blues. Notice that this is called the blues, but this is really modern jazz because it's blues without a singer. top of the notes of the tune like Armstrong did before, and then at the end they would all come together and improvise their own tunes together called jamming. Well, as time went along, New Orleans became an unpopular place for jazz because World War I started. The United States Navy came in and closed down all of the bars and all of the honky-tonks, which are kind of like cheap brothels, where these black players would play. That's kind of why jazz became associated for a long time with music that was unsavory or in unsavory environments, because it was originally the only place they could find work would be in places like bars and honky-tonks. But as the Navy closed these down in World War I so that the sailors wouldn't go to these places, then these musicians had to leave New Orleans and find other places to work.
We have to stop.
Okay, well, I will stop at this point, but just to know that one last thing I'm going to say is that when the musicians started to go north, east, and west out of New Orleans, they would stop in towns, and the styles of jazz that they would originate would be different there. And so there was Kansas City style, and Chicago style, and New York style, and Los Angeles style. And Moscow, there's Moscow style now, that's for sure. And actually, jazz was much more popular in Europe during the early part of the 20th century than it was in the United States, because it wasn't acceptable by most conservative types. So thank you very much, folks, for being a very patient audience. I'm sorry we have to move along, but I know what's happening. There's another class coming, so I hope that you have a good rest of the semester. Take care. It's been a pleasure to be here today.
So, did you like the lecture? Should we invite Professor Preйтер for the future? Thank you very much, Professor Preйтер. You are on our list of highly recommended lecturers. Thank you very much.